In this PowerPoint for development of orofacial structures, we are specifically going to be talking about the development of the palate and the tongue. The development of the palate begins in the 5th week, and it begins with the formation of the primary palate, then the secondary palate, and the completion of the palate happens at 12 weeks. The palate is formed in 3 consecutive stages, and completion of the final palate involves fusion of swellings from different surfaces of the embryo that meet and join. Most other structures develop by joining the swelling of the same surfaces, which leads to elimination of furrows between processes, but the completion of the final palate involves fusion from the anterior palate area that comes from the frontal process, and then the posterior palate, which comes from, or the secondary palate, which comes from the maxillary processes, which comes from the mandibular processes, which comes from branchial arch 1. This table shows the time frame for development of the palate. So 5th to 6th weeks, we have the primary palate that came from the intermaxillary segment that came from the fused medial nasal processes from the frontal process. The 6th to 12th week, we have the secondary palate coming from the palatal shelves that are fusing from the maxillary processes that came from the mandibular process and came from the first branchial arch. And then the 12th week, we have the final palate fusion of all 3 of those processes. So we have the primary palate fusing with the secondary palate to form the whole entire hard palate area. So the primary palate begins with the formation of the intermaxillary segment. The intermaxillary segment is a result of the fusion of the 2 medial nasal processes that come originally from the frontal process. This intermaxillary segment is a wedge shape, so it's kind of like the anterior palate that I've been drawing on the board. So that anterior triangle, the anterior 1/3 of the palatal area. So the intermaxillary segment develops into the primary palate. The primary palate partially separates the developing oral and nasal cavities. That primary palate will become the premaxilla, or the anterior palate, which is really the anterior 1/3 of the palate. The intermaxillary segment is what it starts as, gets a little bigger, then it's called the primary palate. Gets a little bit bigger, it's called the premaxilla, or the anterior palate, which is the anterior 1/3 of the palate. Now this segment, or this intermaxillary segment, primary palate, is where our maxillary incisor teeth come from. So if we take it backwards and forwards like I've been talking about and we need to do in class, if you think about the incisors came from the primary palate, which was the intermaxillary segment, which came from the fusion of the 2 medial nasal processes, which came from the frontal process. So those are the 4 teeth, just the central and lateral incisors on the maxillary, that come from originally the frontal process, which fused into the 2 medial nasal processes, which gave us the intermaxillary segment, which gave us the primary palate, which gives us the anterior palate, or that anterior 1/3 of the hard palate. In the top picture, you can see the medial nasal processes coming together and starting to fuse. And remember, I told you they're going to kind of tuck up to become the intermaxillary segment. You can see the intermaxillary segment, the stomodeum starting to take shape, which is our primitive mouth. You can see the lower lip starting to take shape in the actual brain area. You see the primitive pharynx right there, which is the endoderm portion, and the ectoderm is on the outside towards the front of the stomodeum. So we talked about the primary palate beginning with the formation of the intermaxillary segment that came from a result of a fusion of the 2 medial nasal processes, which came from the frontal process. Our intermaxillary segment turns into, or further develops into the primary palate, and then the primary palate will become the premaxilla and the anterior palate, so the anterior 1/3. The secondary palate, which is our posterior 2/3, begins formation during the 6th week. There's inward growth of the maxillary processes, so the secondary palate comes from the maxillary processes, which came from the mandibular processes, which came from the first branchial arch. So inward growth of the maxillary processes will give rise to two palatal shelves. So the shelves at first come in and they grow vertical. And the tongue is developing at the same time. And as the tongue develops and it drops out of the way, then those vertical shelves can flip up to a horizontal position. And they will flip up into that horizontal position and fuse with each other. The secondary palate will give rise to the posterior 2/3 of the hard palate, as well as the soft palate and uvula, and all of the rest of the maxillary teeth. So we said that the maxillary incisors came from the primary palate, the intermaxillary segment, from the fusion of the two medial nasal processes from the frontal process. So the maxillary incisors come from the frontal process. The maxillary canines and posterior teeth come from the development of the secondary palate that came from the maxillary process, which came from the mandibular process, which came from branchial arch 1. Remember, back and forth it so that you can talk yourself through, so that no matter what question is asked, you can multiple choice get the answer because you followed it back and forth. In the top picture, you can see the developing palatal shelves in a vertical position. These came from the maxillary process, so the palatal shelves are in a vertical position. Now, as the tongue continues to develop and drops down, moves out of the way, those palatal shelves are able to flip up into a more horizontal position, and they will fuse with each other and with the nasal septum, and that palatal shelf along with that will form the secondary palate that along with the primary palate will become the hard palate, and that will separate the oral and nasal cavities. The secondary palate meets the primary palate, and all three of those processes fuse together. The palate is complete during the 12th week. The oral cavity is now completely separated from the nasal cavity at this point. In this picture, we can see the growth of the fused medial nasal processes going into the dark purple intermaxillary segment. We can see the start of the palatal shelves that came from the maxillary processes, and all of this is the start of the palate forming. In these pictures, we can see further development. So our intermaxillary segment developed into this primary palate. That is where our maxillary incisors are coming from the intermaxillary segment that came from the medial nasal processes fusing, that came from the frontal process, and that's our dark purple primary palate. Then we've got our light purple palatal shelves, palatal processes that came from the maxillary process, that came from the mandibular process, that came from the branchial arch 1, which are going to give us our canines and our molars. And you can see it's almost like a little zipper, so they fuse around the secondary and primary palate, the dark purple and the light purple, and then it's almost like a little zipper that's going down that median palatine suture there. And it goes all the way back, and then it even encompasses down to the uvula area. This picture shows the primary palate with the incisor teeth, and then the median palatine suture joining the palatal shelves that came from the maxillary process that give rise to the canine and all of the maxillary posterior teeth. Now, failure of fusion of palatal shelves with the primary palate can result in cleft palate of varying degrees. It could be hereditary or environmental, and a cleft palate is found in 1 in 2,500 cases. Cleft palate is more common in women. Cleft lip is more common in men, specifically left side lip, and we'll talk about the lip a little bit later. And then this can give complications. If there's any kind of cleft lip or palate, there can be complications with nursing or feeding the child, as well as speech issues. We can see the cleft palate, whatever degree there is a failure of the primary or the secondary or the secondary palate to fuse to some degree. Remember, the cleft lip, we've already talked about that being the failure of the fusion of the maxillary process with the medial nasal processes. In this picture, it shows your left side cleft lip. It shows the unilateral cleft lip and palate, so lack of fusion between the primary palate and the secondary palate, as well as picture E showing unilateral cleft lip and the failure of fusion of the primary palate and the secondary palate to fuse. And this would definitely lead to a child not being able to nurse, feed, speech, all kinds of future surgeries and such. And to me, it's just amazing that all of this happens before 12 weeks in utero. So before sometimes people even know that they were pregnant. So the face is already formed and the palate should be complete by 12 weeks. So the nasal cavity is forming right along with the palate, and the septum is going to form from inward growth of the fused medial nasal processes. So we've got that little intermaxillary segment that, tucks up underneath from the medial nasal processes, but it's going to continue to grow inward as well to form the vertical nasal septum, and that's going to fuse with the horizontal hard palate, and that's going to be complete at 12 weeks. Tongue development happens between the 4th and 8th week in utero. So the body of the tongue begins as a swelling on the floor of the primitive pharynx during the 4th week. The swelling is triangle shaped, and it is called the tuberculum impar. Remember, I told you that think about the floor of the mouth being flat, and then as there is growth and development, there is going to be a tuberculum impar that comes on the midline. It's formed on the midline of the mandibular arch. Then there are going to be lateral lingual swellings on either side of that tuberculum impar that are going to grow and encompass that tuberculum impar. They're going to grow anteriorly, and they're going to meet in the middle for the median, where the median lingual sulcus is, and that's going to become the body of the tongue. All three swellings come from branchial arch 1. We're going to find that the body of the tongue develops from the first branchial arch, and then the base of tongue originates later from the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th branchial arches. The lateral lingual swellings that develop on each side of that triangular-shaped tuberculum impar grow and merge and encompass the tuberculum impar, and they're going to grow over and up and out to become the tongue. The median lingual sulcus is going to mark where the anterior or lateral lingual swellings come together in the middle, and then there's cells that degenerate around that lateral lingual swelling to allow the tongue to move. For the base of the tongue, posterior to those fused anterior swellings, or those lateral lingual swellings, are another pair of swellings called a copula. The copula comes from branchial arches 2 and 3. That copula is going to grow to form the base of the tongue. Remember, on the board, I drew the picture of the tuberculum impar, the triangle in the middle. Then I drew the anterior lingual swellings that kind of went forward to make the tongue. I also drew the sulcus terminalis, which is the meeting point between the base and the body of the tongue. I drew the foramen cecum right there, which is the embryonic origin for our thyroid gland. And then I drew the copula right behind the sulcus terminalis, and then the epiglottal swelling right behind that. And that V-shaped sulcus terminalis is where the copula will develop right behind that. The anterior swellings in the tuberculum impar for the body of the tongue developed in front of that area, and then now everything is coming together, base and body. They're going to meet at the sulcus terminalis, and the base of the tongue is going to come from the copula that is right behind there. In these pictures, you can see in the top picture, picture A, you've got the tuberculum impar in the middle and the lateral lingual swellings growing forward, and then they're going to make the actual tongue itself, the body of the tongue. In picture B, you can see the lateral lingual swellings are getting bigger, starting to join in the middle. And in picture C, you can see the whole body of the tongue joined together, looks like a tongue, median lingual sulcus in the middle. Then the number 2 here, we see is going to be encompassed by the anterior lingual swellings, because that's where the tuberculum impar is. Number 3 is behind the sulcus terminalis. That's the copula that is going to make the base of the tongue. And then we've got the epiglottal swelling, and that's coming more from branchial arch 3. And then the epiglottal swelling is going to turn in the epiglottal region, or the epiglottis. And that's coming from branchial arches 4 through 6. The completion of the tongue occurs when the copula of the tongue base merges with the anterior lateral swellings. Where they meet is the fusion is called the terminal sulcus, or the sulcus terminalis. And at the apex of that terminal sulcus is the foramen cecum, which is just that dot. We learned this in oral anatomy that marks the origin of the thyroid gland. The tongue is complete by the 8th week. This table shows the development of the tongue happening between the 4th and 8th week. So the body of the tongue is forming from the tuberculum impar, being encompassed by the growing lateral lingual swellings that are on either side of that encompass the tuberculum impar and make up the body of the tongue. And then the base of the tongue is forming from the copula overgrowing the second branchial arch and making the base of the tongue. And at the 8th week, we have the merger of that anterior surface, the body of the tongue, with the copula area, which is the base of the tongue, and where that merger is the sulcus terminalis, so the dividing line between the base and the body of the tongue. Now the surface of the tongue is ectoderm, and the inside is mesenchyme, which is mesenchyme and neural crest cells and mesoderm. A couple of fun facts about the tongue is ankylglossia is another official term, or the official term for tongue-tied, where there's a short lingual frenum attachment that extends to the tongue apex. So there's sometimes speech issues and that kind of thing, being tongue-tied. I'm sure we've all tried to move the tongue side to side and had a short lingual frenum. The tongue itself usually doubles in length, breadth, and thickness between birth and puberty when it reaches its maximum size. So it doubles in width, length, and thickness between birth and puberty. At birth, the entire tongue is in the oral cavity. That's why babies seem to have just be all tongue. The entire tongue is in the oral cavity at birth. By 4, the base and epiglottic region descend into the oral pharynx, and the body remains in the oral cavity. So when it seems like a baby is all tongue, it's because they are. So that concludes the development of the palate that happens by 12 weeks, and the tongue, which is happening between the 4th and the 8th week, but is complete by the 8th week in utero.